He paid for a stranger girl's treatment. An hour later he saw his ex holding her hand and realized she was his daughter. Alexander Reed had built his name into something larger than life, the kind of reputation that made people lower their voices when he entered a room. At 35 he was a millionaire CEO with a flawless suit, a sharp jawline, and blue eyes that seemed to see only numbers, not people. To him, emotions were liabilities, distractions that weakened a man's focus. He had clawed his way to the top through relentless ambition, and the empire he commanded was both his shield and his prison. His blonde hair was always perfectly combed, his smile measured, and his time too precious to waste on anything that did not return profit. At charity galas he signed checks with the same disinterest he used when authorizing corporate mergers, and yet the world applauded him as generous. Alexander himself felt nothing. But the past had a way of lingering in shadows. There were nights when he sat in his penthouse office high above the city and caught his reflection in the glass. For a moment, instead of the polished image he had built, he would see another version of himself, years younger, sitting in a small cafe, listening to the laughter of a woman with curly brown hair and warm brown eyes. Emily had been the only one who ever pierced his armor, the only one who looked past his arrogance and saw something worth loving. And yet he had driven her away with the same cold logic that made him rich. When she vanished, she had taken more than her presence. She had taken the part of him that could believe in tenderness. He told himself it was for the best. Love was unstable, love distracted men from their goals, and love could be used as a weapon against him. And so he buried the memory of her under deals, skyscrapers, and endless flights to cities where everyone knew his name but no one knew his heart. Years passed and he thought he had erased her completely. Still, there were moments, in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when he felt the hollow space she had left. On a gray morning in early spring, Alexander walked into the marble halls of a private clinic, his mind occupied with figures and contracts. He was there not as a patient but as an investor, another transaction that would expand his empire. His assistant trailed behind him, carrying a stack of folders and listing numbers that blurred together. He was halfway through signing documents when he heard a small, broken sob echo down the corridor. At first he ignored it, people cried in hospitals all the time. But the sound pierced through the shield he had worn for years, raw and trembling. Against his better judgment, he turned his head. Sitting on a narrow bench was a little girl no older than 4, her blonde curls tangled around her flushed face, her tiny hands gripping the edge of her dress as she cried. Her eyes were the most startling shade of blue, clear and deep like the ocean, and for one moment Alexander forgot how to breathe. A nurse leaned down to comfort her, murmuring about treatments and bills, about a mother who couldn't pay. Alexander felt a flicker of irritation at the inefficiency of it all, followed by something far stranger, an ache that pulled at him from the inside. Without thinking, he pulled out his pen and signed another form, instructing the hospital to cover the costs. "Take care of her," he said simply, brushing it off as another act of charity that would earn him applause in the press. And yet, as he walked back through the gleaming halls, something inside him was unsettled. The girl's eyes lingered in his mind, their color too familiar, too piercing, as if they belonged to a story he had tried to erase. He told himself it meant nothing. Just another child, just another expense. But as he left the clinic, a quiet unease curled in his chest, the kind he had no language for. He did not know then that the small act he dismissed so easily would unravel the very foundation of his carefully controlled life. The rain had started by the time Alexander left the clinic, a soft drizzle that painted the pavement with silver reflections. He moved quickly, his driver already waiting near the glass doors, but before he could step into the car something made him pause. He glanced toward the parking lot, perhaps out of habit, and in that ordinary moment his carefully guarded world cracked open. The little blonde girl whose treatment he had just paid for was running across the wet pavement, her curls bouncing as she laughed through the rain. And then, just a few steps behind her, he saw a woman, her figure half hidden beneath an umbrella. She called out to the child, her voice familiar in a way that twisted his chest. When she lifted her head and their eyes met, Alexander felt the ground tilt beneath him. It was Emily. 5 years had passed since she had disappeared from his life, yet the sight of her was so sharp it cut through every wall he had built. Her hair was still the same deep brown, curling in damp waves around her face, her eyes the same rich shade of chestnut that had once been the only warmth in his cold world. But there was something else now, a strength in the way she carried herself, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. She froze when she saw him, her lips parting in shock, her fingers tightening protectively on the little girl's shoulder. And in that single instant Alexander understood a truth so brutal it stole his breath. The child's blue eyes were not random, not coincidence. They were his own eyes, staring back at him from a face that should have been as familiar as his heartbeat. He stood rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to speak. Memories slammed into him, Emily's sudden departure, her silence, the unanswered questions he had buried under money and ambition. Now he knew. She had left because of the child, their child, the daughter he had never met. A daughter who had grown into a laughing, breathing person without him, a daughter whose pain in that clinic had been real, and he had paid for her care as if she were a stranger. His throat closed, his chest tightening with a mix of rage at himself and a grief he couldn't name. Emily's expression hardened quickly, her initial shock vanishing behind a mask of defiance. She bent down to scoop the girl into her arms, holding her close as though shielding her from him. Alexander took a step forward, his mouth opening with words that refused to come. He wanted to demand why she had hidden this from him, why she had stolen these years, but beneath the questions was a guilt that silenced him. He had been the one who pushed her away, who had left her no reason to trust him with something so fragile. He remembered the way he had once laughed at her tears, the way he had dismissed her heart as a complication. Now that cruelty had returned to him, embodied in the form of a daughter who didn't even know his name. The drizzle turned heavier, the sound of it filling the silence between them. Emily turned away without a word, walking swiftly toward her car, the little girl's arms clinging tightly around her neck. Alexander watched them go, his body rigid, his mind a storm. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, a man who lost nothing he could not replace. But as the taillights disappeared into the rain, he realized he had already lost something priceless, something no empire could restore. For the first time in years, Alexander Reed felt powerless. And in that powerless moment, a single thought took root, one that would haunt him: the child he had saved as a stranger was his own flesh and blood. Alexander returned to his penthouse that night, but the space that once felt like a fortress now seemed hollow, echoing with every step he took. The city glittered beneath his windows, the skyscrapers pulsing with life, yet none of it touched him. He dropped his keys on the counter, loosened his tie, and poured himself a drink, though the whiskey burned against his throat like fire. He had always prided himself on his ability to keep control, to compartmentalize, to push feelings into boxes and bury them beneath layers of strategy and ambition. But no wall in his mind could contain the image of the child's face, her golden curls wet from the rain, her blue eyes bright and innocent, staring at him with the same depth as his own reflection. He walked across the wide room, his polished shoes clicking against the marble, and stopped at the massive window overlooking the skyline. He pressed one hand against the glass as if the cool surface might steady him, but the moment his eyes focused on his reflection, he felt an ache so deep it frightened him. Those same blue eyes looked back at him, but now he saw them not only in himself. He saw them mirrored in the little girl who had clung to Emily's neck. His daughter. The word itself felt heavy, foreign, and yet undeniable. He had a daughter he had never met, a daughter who had grown for 4 years without his presence, his guidance, or his love. Guilt gnawed at him, clawing through memories he had tried to forget. He thought back to the day Emily had left, how he had dismissed her fears, how he had smirked at her pain as if it were beneath him. He had been so certain she needed him more than he needed her. And then she was gone, vanishing like smoke, leaving him to convince himself she had been weak, sentimental, unworthy of his world. Now he understood the truth. She had left not because she was weak but because she was strong enough to protect their child from him. That realization struck him like a blow. For years he had told himself he had lost nothing when she walked away, that his empire was enough. Now, in the silence of his penthouse, he knew he had lost everything that ever truly mattered. He moved to his desk, pushing aside the neatly stacked reports and contracts, searching for something he couldn't name. He sat heavily in the leather chair, leaning forward, his elbows on the desk, his head in his hands. His mind replayed the moment outside the clinic, the way Emily had looked at him, not with longing, not even with hatred, but with a fierce protectiveness that cut him out of her life entirely. She had built a world without him, one where their daughter was safe, and in doing so she had condemned him to 4 years of absence he could never undo. The thought of Chloe, he remembered hearing the nurse say her name in passing, growing up believing he was nothing but a stranger, twisted inside him like a knife. The hours bled together as the night deepened. Alexander tried to drown the noise in his head with another glass of whiskey, but even the burn of alcohol couldn't quiet the storm. He saw Chloe's face in every shadow, her laugh in every flicker of sound. He thought of the way she had clung to Emily's hand, her trust so absolute, and he wondered if there was any chance she could ever look at him with even a fraction of that same trust. He had built his life on transactions, but this was something he could not buy, not with all the wealth in the world. By dawn, Alexander was still awake, his eyes red and his chest heavy. He stepped onto the balcony, the cold air biting against his skin, and let the city's noise wash over him. He whispered the word daughter into the wind as if saying it aloud might make it real. He did not know how to face Emily, how to ask for forgiveness when he had been the reason she left in the first place. He did not know how to explain to a little girl why her father had never been there for her first steps, her first words, her first laugh. But beneath all his fear and guilt, one truth had taken root, stronger than the others: he could no longer pretend he didn't care. For the first time in his life, Alexander Reed admitted he was powerless, not against rivals or markets, but against his own past. And as the sun rose over the city, casting light across the steel and glass towers he had once thought were the pinnacle of his success, he realized that none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was a 4-year-old girl with golden curls and blue eyes, and the chance, however slim, that he might one day hear her call him father. The day after the revelation in the parking lot, Alexander could not focus on anything that resembled work. Meetings blurred together, numbers swam before his eyes, and voices of executives sounded like static. His mind kept circling back to the sight of Emily holding the girl in her arms, a girl who carried his blood, his eyes, his very presence in her tiny frame. The realization had cracked him open, but the silence that followed had been even worse. Emily had not said a word to him, she had turned away as though he no longer existed, and that dismissal hurt more than any hostile takeover he had ever endured. For years, he had been the one who decided whose voices mattered and whose did not. Now, in the space of a single moment, she had rendered him invisible, and he discovered he could not bear it. Late that evening he sat in his office, staring at the city lights with his jaw set and his mind racing. He was not the kind of man who waited for answers to come to him. He had always been the one who pursued, who demanded, who bent reality to his will. But this was not a hostile boardroom negotiation. This was his daughter. This was Emily. He knew that if he stormed into her life with his usual arrogance, she would shut the door on him forever. And yet the thought of remaining a stranger to Chloe was unbearable. He had already missed too much. He had missed her first word, her first steps, the countless small moments that stitched a childhood together. He could not let the future be stolen as well. It took every ounce of restraint he had to wait for an opportunity. Through quiet inquiries, he discovered that Emily still lived in the city, though on its quiet outskirts, far from the glass towers he ruled over. He drove there himself one evening, without his driver, without an entourage, parking his car on a dimly lit street lined with modest houses. The air smelled of rain and blooming lilacs, the kind of ordinary beauty he had long forgotten existed. He stood outside her home for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, before finally gathering the courage to step out. Each step toward her door felt heavier than any deal he had ever made. When Emily opened the door, she froze, her hand tightening on the frame as though bracing for impact. She was dressed simply, her curly brown hair tied back, her eyes tired but sharp. Behind her, faint laughter drifted from inside the house, Chloe's laughter, high and unguarded. That sound pierced Alexander's chest, nearly undoing him. He cleared his throat, his voice rougher than he expected. "Emily," he began, but the name caught on his tongue. He had practiced words on the drive over, but now they all felt hollow. Her expression hardened. "You shouldn't be here." Her tone carried no warmth, no trace of the woman who had once looked at him with affection. She started to close the door, but he caught it with his hand, careful not to push too hard, afraid of frightening her or drawing Chloe's attention. "Please," he said, the word foreign and heavy in his mouth. He had spent years commanding, ordering, never asking. Now he was begging, and it scraped against every shard of his pride. "I just want to talk." Emily's eyes flared with anger. "Talk? After 4 years of silence? After leaving me to carry everything alone?" Her voice rose before she forced it back down, glancing over her shoulder to ensure the child hadn't heard. She stepped outside and shut the door behind her, crossing her arms like armor. "You don't get to show up now and pretend you care." Alexander's chest burned. He wanted to defend himself, to say he hadn't known, that she had hidden Chloe from him, but the truth silenced him. He had given her no reason to stay, no reason to trust him with something so precious. He had laughed at her tears once, mocked her vulnerability, and that memory now strangled every excuse. Instead, his voice cracked when he finally spoke. "She's mine, isn't she?" The question felt pathetic, unnecessary, but he needed to hear it from her lips. Emily's face softened for just a fraction of a second before the hardness returned. "Yes," she said finally, her words like a blade. "She's your daughter. And she's everything you were never ready to be responsible for." The air between them thickened, filled with years of silence, pain, and regret. Alexander swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I want to know her," he whispered. "I don't expect forgiveness, not from you, maybe not even from her. But I can't pretend anymore. I can't let another year go by without trying." Emily shook her head, her voice low but fierce. "You don't understand what trying means. She doesn't know you. She doesn't know what you did to me. To her, the world is safe and small and full of love. You could shatter that in an instant if you walk in with your money and your power, thinking it will be enough." Her words cut deep, but Alexander didn't flinch. For once in his life, he did not want to win an argument. He only wanted a chance, no matter how small. He took a step back, lowering his hand from the door, his voice trembling but steady. "Then tell me what I need to do. Whatever it takes, I'll do it." Emily's eyes glistened, though whether from anger or something else, he couldn't tell. She turned away, her hand gripping the doorknob tightly. "Go home, Alexander. Just go." Then she slipped inside, the door closing firmly behind her, leaving him standing on the porch with nothing but the echo of Chloe's laughter drifting through the walls. That night, as he drove back through the quiet streets toward the city's towers, Alexander felt the weight of defeat like he never had before. In the boardroom, failure was temporary, an obstacle to overcome. But here, in the battle for the chance to be a father, failure meant losing something he could never replace. And yet, even as the ache in his chest deepened, one thought kept him steady: he would not give up. Alexander did not return to Emily's doorstep the next day or the day after, though the urge burned in him like a fever. He understood enough to know that if he pushed too hard, she would vanish again, and this time he might never find her. Instead, he began with what little ground he could claim. He reached out through the clinic where he had first seen Chloe, using his influence not as a weapon but as a shield. Specialists were called in quietly, new equipment was delivered without ceremony, and her treatment was expedited with an efficiency that left the doctors whispering about the mysterious benefactor. Emily knew immediately it was him, and though she never said thank you, she did not reject the help. That silence was the smallest opening, but for Alexander it was a door wide enough to step through. Weeks later, by arrangement that came after tense conversations and long silences, Emily allowed him to see Chloe for short visits. She set firm rules, always supervised, always in familiar spaces, never alone. The first time he entered the small living room of their modest home, Alexander felt his chest constrict. Toys littered the floor, children's books stacked unevenly on shelves, and drawings in bright crayons hung on the refrigerator. This world was far from the glass and marble of his penthouse, yet it radiated warmth in a way his home never had. And then Chloe appeared, clutching a stuffed rabbit, her blonde curls bouncing as she peeked around her mother's legs. Her eyes locked on his with the same piercing blue he saw in the mirror every morning, and he felt his knees weaken. He wanted to drop down to the floor immediately, to tell her who he was, but he remembered Emily's warning: do not overwhelm her. So instead he knelt carefully, keeping his voice soft. "Hello, Chloe," he said, his tone more gentle than it had ever been in a boardroom. "I'm Alexander. It's very nice to meet you." Chloe blinked at him, her small brow furrowed in concentration, and then she ducked back behind Emily. The rejection was quiet but sharp, and Alexander felt it like a knife. But he stayed there on the carpet, waiting, speaking not to fill silence but to show her he would not leave. Slowly, over the next visits, he began to earn fragments of her attention. He learned she loved to draw, so he brought sketchpads and boxes of colored pencils, not expensive art kits but the same kind of crayons she already used, because Emily warned him that anything too lavish would frighten the child. He learned Chloe loved stories, so he practiced reading fairy tales at night alone in his penthouse, stumbling over the whimsical words until he could tell them without hesitation. The breakthrough came one rainy afternoon when the power flickered in Emily's house. The storm rattled the windows, and Chloe grew frightened, clutching her rabbit tight. Alexander sat on the floor with her, pulling a flashlight from his pocket, a practical habit from years of travel, and made silly shadow shapes on the wall. At first Chloe only watched, her eyes wide, but when he formed a rabbit to match her toy, she giggled, the sound bright and innocent. That laughter washed over him like absolution. For the first time she crawled into his lap without hesitation, pointing at the wall and demanding more shadows. Alexander's heart broke and healed in the same instant. He wrapped his arms around her carefully, terrified she might slip away, and whispered promises she was too young to understand but that he meant with every fiber of his being. Emily stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the years of betrayal warring against the evidence in front of her. She had raised Chloe alone, sacrificed everything to protect her, and now she watched the man who had once destroyed her hold their daughter as though she were the most precious thing in the world. Part of her still wanted to push him out, to remind him of the nights she had cried alone, but another part of her, quieter and harder to silence, saw something different. He was no longer the man who had smirked at her pain. He was something rawer, something humbled. That evening, when the storm had passed and Chloe was asleep, Emily spoke to him in a low, guarded voice. "She's starting to trust you. Don't break that, Alexander. If you do, I will never let you near her again." He nodded, his throat tight, and answered simply, "I won't." For Alexander, those words were not just a promise to Emily but a vow carved into his very being. He had failed before, but he would not fail now. Every missed year weighed on him like a chain, but he was beginning, piece by fragile piece, to build something new, a bond not born of power but of persistence, patience, and love. And for the first time in his life, he felt that this, not the empire of steel and glass, was what truly defined him. Emily had never been a woman who trusted easily, but after Alexander she had learned to guard herself with a kind of vigilance that felt more like survival than choice. She had built walls around her heart out of necessity, walls that had kept her strong during lonely nights, through Chloe's fevers, through the bills that piled up when she worked double shifts just to make ends meet. For years she told herself she did not need him, that her daughter did not need him, that love was a weakness that destroyed more than it gave. And yet now, watching Chloe laugh in Alexander's arms, those walls began to tremble in ways she did not know how to stop. Every evening when he visited, Emily stood close enough to intervene but far enough to make her presence a reminder. She listened to him stumble through bedtime stories, watched him try to braid Chloe's curls with fingers more accustomed to signing contracts than tying ribbons, and she saw the quiet awe in his eyes every time Chloe reached for him without hesitation. It shook her more than she wanted to admit, because she could not reconcile this man with the one who had once dismissed her tears as inconvenient. She remembered that smirk as clearly as if it had been yesterday, the cruel curve of his lips when she had told him she was pregnant. That memory was a blade she carried inside her, and she drew it whenever her heart began to soften, slicing away at the dangerous thought that maybe, just maybe, he had changed. One night after Chloe had fallen asleep, Emily sat at the small kitchen table while Alexander lingered in the living room, picking up toys and setting them neatly on shelves. The sight of him doing something so ordinary, so domestic, unsettled her. Finally she spoke, her voice sharper than she intended. "Why are you really here, Alexander? Is this guilt? A performance? Or are you trying to control the one thing you didn't before?" He paused, his hands resting on a doll he had just placed back on the shelf. His shoulders stiffened, but when he turned toward her his expression was not anger but exhaustion. "I'm here because I missed everything that matters," he said quietly. "I can't undo the past, Emily. I can't take away the years you carried her alone, or the nights you spent wondering how you would manage. But I can be here now. Not for control. Not for appearances. Just, to be her father. And maybe, if you let me, to prove I can be more than the man I was." His words scraped against her defenses, leaving her unsteady. She wanted to shout at him, to remind him of the pain he had caused, but she couldn't ignore the way his voice cracked when he spoke of Chloe, the way his eyes, those same piercing blue eyes that had once terrified her, now seemed stripped of all arrogance. She folded her arms across her chest, fighting the pull of emotions she didn't trust. "You don't get to erase what you did to me," she whispered, her throat tight. "You don't get to walk in here and expect me to forget." "I don't want you to forget," he answered, stepping closer but stopping short of touching her. "I want you to remember. I want you to remember so you can see the difference between who I was and who I'm trying to be now. I don't deserve forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever. But Chloe deserves more than a father who ran from his mistakes. She deserves someone who stayed. Emily closed her eyes, her hands trembling in her lap. She hated that part of her wanted to believe him, hated that her heart leapt at the thought of Chloe growing up with a father who loved her instead of just a stranger with his eyes. She told herself it was dangerous, that letting him close again could destroy the fragile world she had built. But then she thought of Chloe's giggle when he lifted her into the air, the way her daughter curled into his chest as though she had always belonged there, and her resolve weakened. That night, long after Alexander left, Emily stood at the doorway of Chloe's room, watching her daughter sleep. The little girl's curls spread across the pillow, her lips parted in peaceful dreams, and Emily felt the weight of a question she could no longer avoid. Was she protecting Chloe by keeping Alexander at arm's length, or was she depriving her of something she desperately needed? The answer was not simple, and it terrified her, because for the first time in years Emily realized she was not only fighting to protect her daughter. She was fighting to protect her own heart, which was dangerously close to loving him again. Alexander had always believed that stepping away from his empire was unthinkable, that his presence at every meeting and every deal was what kept the foundation of his company from crumbling. Yet as weeks turned into months, he found himself drifting further from the skyscrapers that had once defined him and closer to the small house on the quiet street where Chloe lived. At first he told himself he could manage both, that he could continue to reign over his empire while showing up as a father, but the balance soon proved impossible. Sitting in a boardroom, he would catch himself thinking about whether Chloe had eaten her lunch at school, or whether she had remembered to bring her stuffed rabbit to nap time, and the details of billion-dollar contracts blurred until they seemed meaningless compared to the tilt of her smile. His colleagues noticed the change. Where once he had been sharp and ruthless, he now grew distracted, his phone filled with pictures of chalk drawings and voice recordings of Chloe reading her first sentences aloud. When a heated argument broke out during a merger negotiation, he caught himself wondering if he had remembered to buy the right kind of crayons she had asked for. It was not that his ambition had died, it was that ambition no longer satisfied him. He realized with an ache in his chest that all the power he had hoarded could not replace the look on Chloe's face when she asked him to push her higher on the swing. The choice became clear on an autumn afternoon when Chloe performed in her preschool recital. She stood on a tiny stage with other children, her curls tied back with a ribbon, her voice high and tentative as she recited a line about stars. Alexander sat in the audience, uncharacteristically nervous, his hands clasped tightly, his throat thick. For a brief moment Chloe searched the crowd, her blue eyes scanning with uncertainty, until they landed on him. When she smiled with relief and raised her hand in a little wave, Alexander felt a rush of pride so fierce it nearly brought him to tears. He understood then that no amount of money or acclaim could compare to being the person his daughter searched for in a crowded room. After the recital, when his phone buzzed with yet another urgent call from the board, he turned it off without hesitation. Emily noticed the gesture, her brow lifting slightly in surprise, but she said nothing. Later that evening, as they sat at the kitchen table while Chloe colored, Alexander confessed in a low voice that he had stepped down from 2 major boards, relinquished deals that would have doubled his fortune, and placed his company in the hands of trusted executives. Emily looked at him as though she wasn't sure whether to believe him, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp with suspicion. "You walked away from everything you built?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I walked away from what I thought mattered," he replied quietly. "I can build again, I can earn again, but I can't rebuild the time I already lost with her. Every day I miss with Chloe is gone forever. I don't want to wake up 10 years from now and realize I've lost her childhood the same way I lost the first 4 years." Emily studied him for a long moment, searching for the arrogance that once poisoned every word he spoke, but it wasn't there. Instead she saw a man who looked weary and raw, stripped of the armor of wealth, someone who had been forced to confront the hollowness of his victories. Part of her wanted to protect herself by doubting him, to keep her guard high, but another part could not ignore the sincerity in his voice. Chloe, oblivious to the heavy conversation, climbed into Alexander's lap with her coloring book, chattering about the stars she had drawn. He wrapped an arm around her and listened with a patience Emily had never seen in him before. Watching them, she felt the fragile outlines of a future she had never allowed herself to imagine, one where her daughter could grow up with both parents present, one where she herself did not have to carry everything alone. The idea both terrified and tempted her, for to accept it meant risking the possibility of heartbreak all over again. That night, after Chloe had gone to bed, Alexander stepped outside onto the porch. Emily joined him reluctantly, her arms folded against the chill. He turned toward her, his expression steady but vulnerable. "I don't know how to fix everything I broke," he admitted, his voice low. "But I know this, I would rather be the man who makes mistakes trying to love you and Chloe than the man who hides behind power and pretends he doesn't care. If you give me the chance, I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Emily did not answer right away. She stared at the darkened street, her heart caught between caution and longing. She remembered the nights she had held Chloe close, whispering promises that she would never let anyone hurt her, and she wondered if trusting Alexander again would betray those promises or finally fulfill them. When she finally looked at him, her eyes softened just enough to make him believe there was hope. She did not say yes, but she did not say no either. And for Alexander Reed, who had once believed control was the only way to live, that small hesitation was more valuable than any certainty. It was the first step toward a future he no longer dared to dream but desperately wanted to build. Winter melted into spring, and with it came a quiet transformation that no one in Alexander's orbit could have predicted. The man who once thrived on endless hours in high-rise offices and measured his worth in numbers and contracts now found his greatest victories in the smallest of moments. He learned to wake early not for calls with foreign investors but to make pancakes for Chloe, though they were uneven and sometimes burnt, and he laughed when she declared them the best in the world anyway. He learned the rhythm of her favorite games, how to braid her curls without pulling too tightly, and how to listen to her stories as though each word were the most important thing he had ever heard. With every day that passed, the walls around him cracked, and the person beneath, vulnerable, flawed, and yearning, began to step into the light. Emily watched this change with a heart torn between fear and wonder. At first she told herself it was temporary, that Alexander's focus would inevitably return to the gleaming empire he had built, and she braced herself for the day he would disappear as suddenly as he had arrived. But the days turned into months, and he did not leave. He missed meetings without apology, ignored phone calls from partners demanding his time, and poured himself into the quiet life that once would have embarrassed him. There were moments when Emily would wake in the night and find him sitting by Chloe's bed, his head bowed as though he were guarding her dreams, and in those moments she saw not the ruthless man she had once fled from but the father her daughter deserved. The turning point came one summer evening when the three of them went to the seaside. Chloe ran across the sand, her curls flying in the wind, her laughter carrying over the waves as she tried to chase the seagulls. Alexander followed, his shoes abandoned behind him, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, and for once he did not look like a man carrying the weight of the world. He looked like a father, breathless and alive, scooping his daughter into his arms as she shrieked with delight. Emily stood back, her bare feet sinking into the sand, and felt something inside her unravel. For years she had lived on vigilance, surviving on strength alone, but in that moment she let herself imagine a life where she no longer had to carry the burden by herself. Later, as the sun melted into the horizon, they sat together on the beach. Chloe fell asleep between them, her small body curled against Alexander's chest, and the hush of the waves wrapped around them. For a long while they said nothing, but silence was no longer hostile. It was a space filled with possibility. Alexander looked at Emily, his expression unguarded, and finally spoke words he had held back for months. "I love her more than I thought I could love anything," he whispered, his voice rough. "And I love you, Emily. I know I don't deserve it, not after everything, but if there's any chance left, any chance at all, I want to build a life with you. Not the one I thought I wanted years ago, but this one, here, with you and her." Emily felt tears sting her eyes, not from pain but from the overwhelming weight of the moment. She thought of the nights she had spent alone, of the fear that had driven her to leave, of the anger that had carried her through the years of silence. And then she thought of Chloe, who deserved a father who stayed. She thought of the man before her, not the arrogant CEO who had once laughed at her vulnerability, but the man who now carried their daughter as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Slowly, with a breath that felt like both surrender and strength, she reached for his hand. "If you break her heart, I'll never forgive you," she said softly. "But I believe you can be the man she needs. And maybe the man I once hoped you could be." In that fragile moment, the world shifted. The pain of the past did not vanish, but it no longer defined them. They had walked through fire and silence and regret, and somehow they had found themselves here, on the shore, together again. As the last light of day slipped into the sea, Alexander pressed a kiss to Chloe's forehead and then looked at Emily with eyes that held no arrogance, only devotion. And Emily, for the first time in years, let herself believe in a future that was not shaped by fear but by love. When they returned home, the life they began to build was not grand or extraordinary. It was simple, filled with family dinners, bedtime routines, and small joys stitched into ordinary days. But for Alexander Reed, the man who had once thought love was a weakness, it was more powerful than any empire he had ever ruled. He had lost years, but he had been given a second chance, and this time he held onto it with both hands, determined never to let go.